The world was stunned when Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was pronounced dead on August 16, 1977. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, fans sobbed in the streets, and newspapers around the globe carried headlines that seemed almost impossible to believe. But as the shock of his sudden passing spread, whispers began to circulate. Something about Elvis's death didn't add up, and the events that unfolded in the days that followed only deepened the mystery. His funeral drew thousands, yet those who looked upon him in the casket came away unsettled, claiming he didn't look quite right. His skin seemed waxy, his features unfamiliar, his body strangely preserved. Then came the most chilling revelation of all: reports that the casket had been reopened in secret, and that what was discovered inside left even family members speechless. Was it really Elvis Presley who lay beneath the satin lining? Or had the king's final performance been a carefully constructed illusion? On the morning of August 16, 1977, the walls of Graceland echoed with a silence that felt unnatural. Elvis Presley, once the unstoppable force of American music, had been discovered lifeless on the bathroom floor of his Memphis mansion. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, was the one who found him. A moment so surreal it would haunt her forever. Paramedics were rushed to the scene, their sirens cutting through the humid Tennessee air, but there was little they could do. The king was gone, declared dead at just 42 years old. Within hours, the news spread across the globe, halting television programming and filling radio waves with nothing but Elvis songs. Fans outside Graceland fainted from shock, while others cried openly, unable to process the truth. Yet even as the world mourned, questions began to swirl. Witnesses whispered that the timeline of events didn't seem to match, that Elvis had been seen earlier that morning in better condition, and that something about the rush to remove his body felt suspicious. The official cause of death, a heart attack, was quickly announced, but medical reports hinted at drug involvement, sparking rumors of cover-ups. The embalming process was ordered almost immediately, adding fuel to speculation that certain truths were being hidden. Family members tried to maintain composure, but whispers inside Graceland told of arguments and confusion, as if no one could agree on how to handle the death of the world's most famous entertainer. By the time the body was prepared for the public viewing, many felt that the Presley family and authorities were less concerned with honesty than with preserving an image, and fans began to wonder whether the king's death had been as straightforward as the headlines claimed. Graceland became a fortress of grief in the days after Elvis Presley's death, its gates surrounded by thousands of fans desperate for a final glimpse of the man who had defined a generation. Vernon Presley, heartbroken and visibly aged overnight, made the decision to allow an open casket viewing inside the mansion, giving fans and close friends one last chance to say goodbye. On August 17th, the casket was placed in the foyer beneath the stained glass archways, guarded heavily by security, and slowly the mourners filed in. What they saw, however, stirred an unease that would never fade. Elvis's body lay dressed in a white suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands folded gently on his chest, but his appearance was strikingly off. Many described his skin as waxy and plastic, too smooth for a man who had been fighting years of health issues. Others pointed out that his nose seemed slimmer, his jawline too sharp, his face unnaturally youthful. The hands, which fans knew so well from countless concerts, looked swollen and oddly stiff. Whispers filled the room, some even suggesting that the figure inside the casket resembled a wax dummy more than the flesh and blood man who had electrified the world from stages in Vegas and stadiums across the globe. Outside, The media swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to share an impression. And though many expressed sorrow, there were countless who confessed quietly that they didn't believe they were looking at Elvis at all. The funeral itself, held the following day, was a spectacle of sorrow. A procession carried the casket through Memphis streets, with mourners stretching for miles, weeping, singing, and throwing flowers onto the hearse. But even in this public display of grief, the unease persisted. Why had Elvis's body been presented in such a strange state? Why did so many insist he looked too perfect, almost staged, as though the king's final appearance had been carefully constructed to hide something deeper? By the time the casket was lowered into the ground at Forest Hill Cemetery, the seeds of doubt had been firmly planted. And for many, this funeral was not an ending, but the beginning of one of music's greatest mysteries. In the days that followed Elvis Presley's funeral, a story began to circulate that deepened the mystery surrounding the king's final moments. According to whispers within Memphis, the casket had not remained sealed after the funeral, but had instead been reopened in private under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some claimed it was necessary to adjust the embalming. Others insisted Vernon Presley ordered it to ensure his son was truly at rest. And a few suggested something far stranger, that there were doubts about who or what had actually been placed in that satin-lined box. Witnesses spoke quietly of unusual activity at Graceland late at night, when funeral staff and Presley family members gathered around the casket once more. What they allegedly found inside left them shaken. While official accounts would never confirm it, insiders described subtle but undeniable differences in the body's appearance. Some said the skin tone had shifted dramatically, appearing more artificial than ever, as though the embalming process had been tampered with or covered up. Others swore that the body seemed to have changed altogether, fueling theories that it wasn't Elvis lying there at all. Reports of Vernon Presley's behavior only added to the tension, his mood swinging wildly between grief and agitation, his insistence on strict secrecy, leading many to believe he was hiding something more than sorrow. Family members who were present at the second viewing rarely spoke publicly, but when pressed in interviews years later, their words often contradicted one another. Some flatly denied that the casket had ever been disturbed, while others hinted vaguely at necessary adjustments that were made. What could have required such adjustments after the world had already been given their final look at the king? For many, the act of reopening the casket was a moment of chilling significance, an indication that not everything about Elvis's death or burial was as straightforward as the public was led to believe. In fact, it was this act, the quiet, secretive reopening of the casket, that would become the foundation of decades of conspiracy theories, leading fans to believe that the king's story didn't end with the closing of those Graceland gates, but with something far more unsettling hidden inside the coffin itself. Of all the theories that emerged after Elvis Presley's death, none has been more persistent or more disturbing than the belief that the body displayed in the casket was not Elvis at all, but a carefully crafted wax dummy. This theory began almost immediately after the public viewing, when fans who had seen the king countless times up close insisted that the figure lying in the coffin simply didn't look like him. Observers noted a strange bead of sweat on the forehead, something that should have been impossible on a body that had been embalmed. Others swore that the skin appeared too smooth, too polished, like sculpted wax rather than human flesh. The nose appeared thinner, the eyebrows less natural, the hands bloated and oddly shaped, as if molded rather than organic. Some even claimed that the body seemed too slim compared to the Elvis, who, in his final years, had been noticeably heavier. These discrepancies gave birth to the chilling suggestion that the Presley family, desperate to shield the world from the king's deteriorating condition, had used a wax replica to stand in for his corpse. The theory gained further traction when morticians who had supposedly worked on Elvis's body provided conflicting statements. Some said embalming had been rushed due to the heat, while others denied even seeing the process carried out. The lack of clarity created fertile ground for speculation, and then came the most bizarre claim of all, that the dummy had been placed in the casket because Elvis himself was not dead, but alive and preparing to disappear from public life forever. The so-called Elvis is alive movement found its foundation here, in the idea that what fans had mourned at Graceland was not the real king, but a decoy meant to fool the public. Skeptics dismissed the theory as tabloid fodder, yet the photographs, testimonies, and eerie details from those who stood inches from the casket gave it strength. Decades later, people still debate whether the figure in white was Elvis Presley or nothing more than wax and makeup. For believers, the wax dummy theory is not just speculation, it is proof that what lay inside the casket was never meant to tell the truth, but to protect a secret the world was not ready to face. If the casket itself left fans uneasy, the official documents surrounding Elvis Presley's death only made matters worse. The autopsy, conducted shortly after his body was taken from Graceland, was supposed to provide clarity. But instead, it created more questions than answers. Initially, the Shelby County Medical Examiner announced that Elvis had died of a heart attack, a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. But as weeks turned into months, the story began to unravel. Toxicology reports revealed an alarming number of prescription drugs in his system: painkillers, barbiturates, and sedatives, some in dangerously high levels. Yet instead of publishing the complete findings, officials sealed critical portions of the autopsy for 50 years, a decision that stunned both the public and medical experts. Pages were missing, details were redacted, and even the doctors who had been involved contradicted one another in interviews. Some described an enlarged heart, others emphasized liver damage, while still others suggested that the drug levels alone should have been listed as the cause of death. Why so many conflicting accounts? Why was so much information hidden? For conspiracy theorists, the missing pages became a smoking gun, proof that authorities were hiding something monumental. Was it to protect the Presley legacy from the embarrassment of drug abuse? Or was it, as some suspected, because the autopsy would have revealed that the body examined was not Elvis Presley at all? When reporters pressed Vernon Presley about the decision to seal the files, his answers were evasive, fueling speculation that he had agreed to keep certain truths buried with his son. The FBI and DEA were rumored to have had interests in the case, given Elvis's connections to prescription drug abuse and his honorary federal badge. Did government involvement play a role in ensuring the real details never saw daylight? For decades, the unanswered questions have lingered like a dark shadow over the king's passing. Every missing page and every contradictory statement has reinforced the suspicion that what lay in the casket and what was reported on the autopsy table may not have matched at all. And until those sealed documents are finally opened, the mystery of what the medical examiners truly found will remain one of the most haunting aspects of Elvis Presley's death. Beyond the official files and the family's guarded silence, it was the voices of those who stood closest to Elvis Presley's casket that carried the greatest weight. Over the years, morticians, funeral staff, security guards, and even close friends spoke in hushed tones about what they saw. and their testimonies did not always align with the story the public was told. Several funeral home employees reportedly remarked that the body did not resemble the Elvis they remembered. One recalled bluntly, "That wasn't the king I worked for," describing how the features seemed stiff, artificial, and unnaturally youthful for a man who had been bloated and worn down by years of poor health. Another claimed that the sideburns looked glued on, like those of a mannequin rather than real hair. Fans who attended the public viewing echoed these sentiments. They lined up for hours under the blazing Memphis sun, filing past the open casket for only a few seconds each. Yet, many left whispering to one another that something wasn't right. Some described the face as too perfect. Others noted the hands looked oddly swollen, and still others swore the body appeared slimmer than Elvis had been just days before. Ginger Alden, the woman who had found him, gave interviews where her descriptions of that final viewing seemed hesitant and strangely detached, as if she too sensed a difference she couldn't quite explain. Even members of Elvis's inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia, hinted at inconsistencies. Joe Esposito, his longtime road manager, was pressed on whether the body in the casket looked authentic, and though he maintained loyalty, his vague answers only stoked suspicion. The most chilling account came from a security guard assigned to Graceland during the funeral, who later claimed that the body had been replaced altogether before the public viewing. According to his story, only family members saw the true remains, while the masses were shown something else entirely. Such testimonies, scattered across decades of interviews, books, and documentaries, have kept the fire of speculation alive. When pieced together, they paint a haunting picture that the figure mourned by thousands may not have been Elvis Presley at all, but a carefully crafted image designed to close the chapter on his life while concealing the truth of what really happened. If the public's doubts could be dismissed as grief-stricken imagination, the behavior of Elvis Presley's own family made the mystery even harder to ignore. Vernon Presley, devastated by the sudden loss of his only son, was said to have grown unusually protective of the casket. He ordered heavy security around it, forbidding unauthorized access, and his instructions were carried out with such intensity that many began to suspect there was more at stake than mourning. Vernon gave interviews in the days after the funeral, but his statements often seemed contradictory. At one moment, he insisted that Elvis's body had been carefully prepared and looked at peace, but at another, he hinted that adjustments had to be made because things didn't look right. Those words, vague and heavy with implication, fueled the belief that the body seen by the public was not the same one Vernon had seen privately. Priscilla Presley, meanwhile, remained mostly silent. When pressed by reporters, she offered condolences and memories, but avoided direct questions about the viewing, as though speaking about it was off-limits. Even years later, when she opened up in interviews and books about her marriage, her time at Graceland, and Elvis's struggles, she consistently dodged details about the casket and the funeral. Lisa Marie Presley, only 9 years old at the time, was too young to fully understand. But as she grew older, her statements about her father's death shifted in tone, sometimes sounding certain, other times hesitant, as though she too had been left with unresolved doubts. Members of the extended Presley family gave conflicting accounts as well. Some swore that the body was Elvis and that the family had no reason to deceive, while others, speaking in private decades later, admitted that even they were unsettled by what they saw. These contradictions, paired with the family's refusal to release the full autopsy and the decades-long sealing of records, created the impression of a carefully maintained secret. why such silence? Was it to preserve Elvis's dignity in death, shielding him from the world's gaze after years of relentless scrutiny? Or was it because the truth about what lay in that casket was too explosive to be revealed? The Presley family's guarded words and evasive answers ensured that the mystery would not fade with time, but instead grow stronger, leaving fans to wonder if the king's final chapter had been rewritten by those closest to him. The story of Elvis Presley's casket did not end with the lowering of the coffin into the ground at Forest Hill Cemetery. In fact, for many, that moment was just the beginning. The rumors of the casket being reopened, the unsettling appearance of the body, the whispers of wax dummies and swapped remains, all of it became the foundation for one of the most enduring legacies in music history. To this day, fans debate not just how Elvis died, but whether he ever truly left at all. Sightings began almost immediately. Within months of his burial, reports surfaced of Elvis being spotted at airports, gas stations, and restaurants across America. A man resembling him was photographed buying a ticket to Argentina. Another was seen driving a limousine in Las Vegas, and still others swore they heard his voice on late-night phone calls. Each story tied back to the belief that the body in the casket had been a decoy, placed there to give the world closure while the king slipped quietly into hiding. Tabloids fueled the fire with headlines screaming "Elvis lives," and conspiracy groups emerged, dedicated to proving that the man mourned by millions had staged his death to escape fame, debt, and declining health. Skeptics dismissed these tales as fantasy, yet the inconsistencies in the official record kept the theories alive. The missing autopsy pages, the family's silence, the witnesses who insisted the body looked artificial, all combined to create a puzzle with missing pieces. A puzzle that fans have tried to complete for nearly 50 years. But beyond the sensational claims of Elvis still breathing somewhere in secret, the casket mystery left a deeper, more haunting impact. Doubt. Doubt in official stories. Doubt in authority. Doubt in the very idea that death always brings truth. For those who stood outside Graceland in August of 1977, the grief was real, the loss was unbearable, but so too was the nagging sense that something had been concealed. That sense has not faded with time. Even today, documentaries, books, and endless online discussions revisit the strange details of Elvis's funeral, treating the casket not as a symbol of closure, but as a door that never fully shut. Was the body a poorly embalmed version of a man broken by fame and prescription drugs? Or was it a wax figure meant to hide a darker secret? Was Vernon Presley guarding his son's dignity? Or was he protecting a truth that would have shaken the world? These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps they never will. But the fact that they persist speaks to the power of Elvis Presley's legend. His music may have stopped on that August day, but the mystery of his casket ensured that his story would never truly end. It haunts fans because it refuses to be solved, because it keeps the king alive in a different way, not just as a voice on the radio or a memory on film, but as a myth that continues to challenge what we believe about life, death.
It was taken from a karate suit, just a regular karate type outfit. Are they coming to get me? Is that it?
I mean, does this indicate that...
For nearly half a century, fans believed they knew the story of Elvis Presley's life and family. But today, a man named Chewy Thompson has stepped into the spotlight, and the revelation he brings threatens to change the king's legacy forever. After whispers of hidden children circulated for decades, it seemed like just another rumor until now. Chewy Thompson, an unassuming man who spent most of his life in obscurity, has taken a DNA test that links him directly to Elvis Presley's bloodline. The results shocked not only him, but also the Presley estate, which has guarded Elvis's memory and inheritance for generations. For the first time, someone outside the known Presley family has undeniable proof of their connection to the king of rock and roll. But who is Chewy Thompson? How did this test come about, and what does it mean for the Presley family, for Graceland, and for Elvis's enduring legend? This is the shocking story of Elvis Presley's secret grandson. From the moment Elvis Presley was laid to rest in August of 1977, the world mourned not just the loss of a man, but the end of an era. Yet even in death, Elvis could not escape the endless swirl of speculation that clung to his name. Fans whispered of secret lovers, hidden diaries, and even the possibility that the king himself had faked his death. But one rumor endured more than most: the idea that Elvis had fathered children the public would never know about. Stories surfaced from women who claimed to have shared private moments with the superstar during his whirlwind tours. Some spoke of nights spent in hotel rooms where security guards turned a blind eye. Others recalled long drives where Elvis poured his heart out, confessing how lonely life at the top could be. A few went further, claiming those nights had left them with something more than just a memory. They said they carried his child. Newspapers at the time dismissed these women as opportunists looking for attention, yet their voices continued to echo across decades. In the 1980s and 1990s, magazines regularly ran articles speculating about hidden heirs. Some claimed to have photographs of young men and women who looked eerily like Elvis, their faces carrying the unmistakable Presley features: the piercing eyes, the sharp jawline, the famous smirk. But without proof, the Presley estate dismissed every claim, often responding with silence or legal threats. Fans, however, weren't so quick to forget. At Graceland tours, whispers spread between visitors. What if Elvis had children we don't know about? Others speculated that Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had worked to cover up such stories to protect the family image and financial stability of the estate. Over time, it became almost a part of the Elvis mythos itself. The king, larger than life, leaving behind mysteries too wild to believe, yet too tantalizing to ignore. Even music historians couldn't help but wonder. Elvis was, after all, a man adored by millions of women, a man constantly on the road, living at a pace few could imagine. Was it truly so far-fetched to think there might be someone out there carrying his bloodline, hidden from the spotlight? As the years passed, these stories faded into the background, becoming little more than a shadow in the king's enormous legacy. That is, until a man named Chewy Thompson stepped forward. Unlike the others before him, he didn't come with a tabloid interview or a vague resemblance. He came armed with science, DNA evidence that could no longer be ignored, and in doing so, he reopened a chapter of Elvis's story that many thought had finally been closed. For decades, Chewy Thompson was just another face in the crowd, a man who lived a quiet and unassuming life, far from the glitz and glamour of Graceland. He wasn't a performer, he wasn't a man chasing fame, and in fact, he rarely even spoke about his unusual family history. Born to a mother who carried secrets heavier than she could bear, Chewy grew up hearing only whispers of who his grandfather might be. His mother never confirmed it outright, but she often hinted at a man who was once larger than life. A man, she said, had a voice that could move mountains and a presence that could shake the earth. For a child, it sounded more like myth than truth. Chewy himself often dismissed these stories as fanciful tales, just fragments of a mother's nostalgia or imagination. But as he grew older, and as he looked in the mirror, he began to notice features that drew attention. People would tell him he had eyes that looked familiar, a smile that seemed to remind them of someone they couldn't quite place, and a jawline that looked like it belonged to a star from another time. Those who knew music history sometimes joked, "You look a bit like Elvis Presley," though Chewy never took it seriously. Instead, he focused on building a simple life. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and lived far from the spotlight. His nickname, Chewy, came from his childhood. when friends teased him for always chewing gum during school, and the name stuck with him into adulthood. It was hardly the name of someone destined for celebrity, and in many ways, it defined his personality. Laid back, humble, and uninterested in chasing grandeur. Yet behind that humble exterior was a growing curiosity. Family gatherings were always laced with strange tension when the subject of his mother's past came up. Whenever Elvis Presley's name was mentioned on television, a hush would fall over the room, and his mother's expression would tighten, as if the past was clawing its way back into the present. Chewy began to suspect that the stories weren't just fantasy, they were fragments of a truth his mother couldn't bear to reveal. By his teenage years, he started digging into old photos and timelines, comparing his mother's life with Elvis's touring schedule, and he discovered overlaps that made his heart race. The possibility that he could be connected to the king of rock and roll was almost too much to believe, but instead of chasing it, Chewy buried the thought. He wasn't interested in being labeled a fraud or an attention seeker, and he certainly didn't want to invite ridicule. For years, he lived in the shadows of that unspoken secret, trying to ignore the whispers and coincidences, but fate has a way of forcing the truth into the light. As DNA testing became more common and more accessible, Chewy found himself standing at a crossroads. He could either go to his grave never knowing, or he could face the truth head-on, regardless of what it meant for him, for his mother's memory, and for the Presley family. The man who once tried to hide in obscurity was about to become the center of a story that would ripple across the world. For years, Chewy Thompson carried the unspoken suspicion of his true identity like a quiet burden. He avoided talking about it, fearing that the world would laugh at him if he ever dared to connect his name with Elvis Presley. But in recent years, as consumer DNA testing grew more common, curiosity became impossible to ignore. Friends encouraged him to finally find out. Family members urged him to stop living in limbo. Chewy resisted at first, but then came the moment that changed everything. One quiet evening, after staring at the small plastic kit on his kitchen table, he decided it was time. He swabbed his cheek, sealed the envelope, and sent away a piece of his truth. Weeks later, when the results arrived, his hands shook as he opened the email. At first, the screen was a blur, the scientific numbers and charts overwhelming. But then he saw the one line that froze him in place. A 99.9% DNA match to the Presley bloodline. The test didn't just suggest a possibility, it confirmed it beyond doubt. The results linked him directly to the lineage of the king of rock and roll, leaving no room for speculation. The weight of that discovery hit him like a tidal wave. His mother's hints and silences, the way family gatherings fell quiet whenever Elvis's name came up, the jokes about his uncanny resemblance, all of it suddenly made sense. Chewy sat in silence for hours, staring at the screen, realizing that his life would never again be the same. But DNA results don't stay secret for long. Once word leaked to extended family members, the story spread like wildfire. Some relatives treated the revelation with awe, whispering that it explained everything they'd always suspected. Others reacted with disbelief, convinced it had to be a mistake or, worse, a fabrication. But science doesn't bend to opinion, and the cold facts of DNA spoke louder than anyone's denial. Chewy now faced an impossible choice: stay silent, live with this knowledge quietly, and protect himself from scrutiny, or step forward and tell the world, knowing the storm it would unleash. The Presley estate had long guarded Elvis's legacy, carefully managing every piece of memorabilia, every performance recording, every aspect of his name. For Chewy to come forward meant challenging one of the most powerful celebrity estates in history. But the truth weighed heavier than the fear. After decades of speculation, here at last was undeniable proof that Elvis Presley had left behind more than the world ever knew. Chewy Thompson wasn't just another man with a wild claim. He was the living embodiment of a secret that could rewrite the Presley story forever. When news of Chewy Thompson's DNA results reached the Presley family, the reaction was nothing short of explosive. For decades, The Presley legacy had been carefully guarded, its public image managed with precision, and its wealth and influence tightly controlled. Now, suddenly, there was a new name tied to Elvis Presley's bloodline, and it was one that could not easily be ignored. Within days of the revelation, insiders close to the family began to whisper about growing tension behind closed doors. Some relatives were reportedly outraged, calling the claim outrageous and dismissing Chewy as a fraud, despite the scientific evidence. Others, however, were far more cautious, knowing that DNA evidence could not simply be brushed aside. The Presley family had always been under scrutiny, especially in the decades following Elvis's death. His only child, Lisa Marie Presley, had carried the weight of his legacy on her shoulders, and after her passing, that responsibility fell to her own children. To introduce another heir into that delicate balance threatened not only emotional stability, but also legal and financial control. The idea that Elvis had a grandson who had been kept in the shadows for so long was unthinkable to many of them. The estate, already worth hundreds of millions, could face complicated questions about rights, ownership, and inheritance. But beyond the financial stakes, there was something deeper: pride, identity, and legacy. Some family members reportedly expressed heartbreak at the thought that Elvis, who had always struggled with loneliness and longed for genuine connections, might have fathered a child who never had the chance to know him. Others felt protective of Elvis's memory, insisting that such revelations threatened to tarnish his legend. At Graceland, where fans come daily to honor the king, whispers began to circulate among staff and visitors. Tour guides were reportedly told to avoid discussing the story, yet the questions came anyway. Is it true Elvis has a secret grandson? Will he visit Graceland? The pressure mounted with every headline and every new interview request. For Chewy, the reaction was a mix of cold rejection and quiet acceptance. While some Presley relatives refused to acknowledge him, others reached out cautiously, not ready to embrace him fully, but curious enough to listen. It was clear that the revelation had cracked open old wounds and insecurities, forcing the Presley family to confront something they had long feared: the possibility that the story they had defended for decades was incomplete. The Presley name had always been bigger than life, but now, with Chewy's emergence, it was suddenly fragile. The family's response, divided and emotional, only deepened the mystery and raised a chilling question. Was the Presley legacy strong enough to withstand the truth? When the story of Chewy Thompson's DNA results broke into the public sphere, it spread like wildfire. Within hours of the first leaked report, major outlets around the world were running headlines. Elvis Presley's secret grandson steps forward, and DNA test confirms Presley bloodline. Talk shows, podcasts, and tabloids latched onto the story with relentless energy, and social media became a battlefield of speculation, disbelief, and excitement. For lifelong Elvis fans, the revelation was shocking, but not entirely unbelievable. Many had spent years entertaining theories that the king had fathered children beyond Lisa Marie. Elvis's charisma, his touring lifestyle, and his undeniable relationships with countless women during the height of his fame had always fueled the possibility. Now, for the first time, there was scientific proof to back up what had long been considered nothing more than rumor. Some fans responded with warmth, flooding Chewy's accounts with messages of support. They claimed they could see Elvis's spirit in his face, his gestures, even the way he carried himself in interviews. They saw him not as an intruder, but as an extension of the king's legacy, a living reminder that Elvis's bloodline still thrived in unexpected corners of the world. Yet not everyone was so welcoming. Skeptics immediately accused Chewy of chasing fame, pointing out that dozens of people over the years had falsely claimed to be Elvis's long-lost child or relative. They questioned the legitimacy of the DNA test, suggesting it might have been manipulated or staged for attention. Hardcore fans loyal to the Presley estate even accused Chewy of trying to profit off Elvis's name, warning that his presence threatened to destabilize the legacy they cherished. The media, of course, thrived on the controversy. Tabloids ran side-by-side photo comparisons of Elvis and Chewy, highlighting their similar jawlines and piercing eyes. Late-night hosts made jokes about the king's secret heir, while entertainment programs speculated about what this could mean for the future of Graceland. Even mainstream news outlets took notice, interviewing legal experts about inheritance rights and genealogists about the reliability of DNA tests. Outside of newsrooms, the streets around Graceland saw an uptick in curious visitors. Fans left notes at the gates, some welcoming Chewy into the Presley family, others demanding proof beyond a test. At candlelight vigils for Elvis, his name was still chanted, but Chewy's name began to emerge in conversations, dividing fans who wanted to embrace him from those who felt betrayed by the idea of a hidden truth. For Chewy himself, the sudden media storm was overwhelming. He had lived most of his life in anonymity, but overnight he became the focus of international attention. Cameras followed him, journalists camped outside his home, and strangers recognized him on the street. What had begun as a quiet search for truth now spiraled into a public reckoning, one where the world debated not just his identity, but the very legacy of Elvis Presley. For the first time in decades, the king's story wasn't being told by biographers or family members. It was being rewritten by science, the media, and a man who never asked to be famous. The moment DNA confirmed Chewy Thompson's connection to Elvis Presley, the story stopped being just about family or legacy. It became a legal earthquake. For decades, the Presley estate has stood as one of the most lucrative and carefully managed celebrity estates in history. Graceland alone brings in millions of dollars each year as both a tourist attraction and a shrine to the king of rock and roll. Add in publishing rights, royalties, licensing deals, and memorabilia auctions, and the Presley fortune has remained a powerhouse long after Elvis's death. But the revelation of a new blood relative with direct lineage throws open doors no one wanted to unlock. Lawyers immediately weighed in, stating that Chewy, as Elvis's grandson, could theoretically have legal claims to inheritance rights, depending on how wills and trusts were structured. Even though Elvis left everything to his father, and then to his daughter Lisa Marie, the existence of an undisclosed heir raises questions about whether certain documents could be challenged. Legal analysts warned that if Chewy pursued his rights, the estate could be tied up in years of court battles, costing millions in legal fees and reshaping how Elvis's legacy is managed. For the Presley family, the stakes were personal and financial. They had fought hard over the years to protect Elvis's image and to keep control of the vast fortune he left behind. Introducing a new heir into that equation could mean redistributing wealth, reassigning control, or at the very least, sharing profits with someone who had been kept outside the circle for decades. Beyond inheritance, there were questions of identity rights. Elvis's name and likeness are trademarks that generate massive revenue through film, merchandise, and music reissues. If Chewy is legally recognized as Elvis's descendant, could he have a say in how those rights are used? Would he be entitled to a percentage of profits every time Elvis's image appears on an album, a poster, or a souvenir sold at Graceland? The possibility sent shockwaves through both the Presley camp and the business world that profits from Elvis's enduring popularity. Some insiders whispered that the Presley estate would do everything in its power to keep Chewy from gaining legal standing. Others suggested quiet negotiations might already be happening, with lawyers working behind closed doors to reach a settlement before the matter reached the courts. Meanwhile, fans and the public speculated about whether Chewy even wanted the money. In interviews, he hinted that he was not motivated by wealth, but by recognition, by the chance to be acknowledged as part of the story, rather than erased from it. Still, the legal system doesn't care about sentiment. Contracts, trusts, and laws are black and white, and the arrival of a confirmed grandson creates legal complexity no estate executor can ignore. Whether Chewy decides to pursue claims or not, his very existence changes the legal landscape surrounding Elvis Presley forever. It raises a haunting question. Will the king's legacy continue to be about music, culture, and memories, or will it become mired in courtroom battles over who truly owns the name Presley? When the noise of the media storm became deafening, and when the Presley estate's silence only fueled more speculation, Chewy Thompson finally chose to speak for himself. Sitting down for his first public interview, his demeanor was not that of a man chasing celebrity or fortune. Instead, he appeared nervous, grounded, and even reluctant, as though the spotlight he suddenly found himself under was the last thing he ever wanted. When asked about the DNA test, his voice carried a mix of disbelief and acceptance. "I didn't do it to get attention," he said quietly. "I did it because I needed to know the truth. My whole life, I've had questions. My mother never told me outright, but there were things she said, things that didn't add up. I just wanted clarity." He admitted that when the results confirmed his connection to Elvis Presley, he was overwhelmed. "I sat there staring at the screen. I thought maybe it was a mistake. But then I realized it explained everything. The looks I would get, the comments, even the way my family acted whenever his name came up. I knew in my heart it was true. And now the world knows too." Chewy insisted that money was not his motivation. In fact, he spoke about his reluctance to even come forward. "I didn't want this," he confessed. "I don't want to fight anyone. I don't want to take over Graceland or demand anything from the family. All I want is acknowledgement, to know where I come from, to be able to say out loud who I really am without people laughing at me." He described the strange pressure that comes with being linked to Elvis. Fans expect charisma, music, or at least some reflection of the king in the way he carries himself. But Chewy, a man who spent most of his life working regular jobs and living quietly, struggles with the weight of those expectations. "I'm not Elvis," he said firmly. "I'm just me. I can't live up to that, and I'm not trying to. But at the same time, I feel him in me, not in a mystical way, but in the blood, in the little things I do, the way I move, the way I think sometimes. It's strange, but it's real." Perhaps the most moving part of his interview came when he spoke about the king not as a legend, but as a grandfather he never knew. "I wonder sometimes what it would have been like to meet him, to talk to him, even just once, to hear his voice not from a record, but in person. People see Elvis the superstar, but I think about Elvis the man, the father, the grandfather. That's who I'll never know, and that's the hardest part. The money, the fame, that doesn't matter. What hurts is knowing there was someone out there who was part of me, and I never got the chance to share a moment with him." His words resonated with fans in a way that no lawyer, no estate representative, and no headline ever could. They revealed a man not hungry for fortune, but longing for belonging, a man caught in a whirlwind he never asked for, yet strong enough to stand in front of the world and tell his truth. For Chewy Thompson, this isn't about rewriting Elvis Presley's legacy. It's about writing his own story at last, one that had been hidden in the shadows for too long. As the dust settles around Chewy Thompson's revelation, one thing has become certain: the story of Elvis Presley will never be the same again. For nearly 5 decades, the king of rock and roll's legacy has been preserved in carefully polished marble, a narrative guarded by family, lawyers, and the walls of Graceland. Elvis was the poor boy from Tupelo who rose to become the most famous man on earth, the cultural giant who changed music forever, and the tragic figure who left this world too soon at just 42. Fans thought they knew the whole story, but the arrival of a secret grandson has cracked that perfect image wide open, forcing the world to see Elvis not only as an icon, but as a man whose personal life held secrets as profound as his music. For some, Chewy's existence reaffirms what they always suspected, that Elvis, with his endless charisma and constant loneliness, may have left behind more than the public was allowed to see. For others, it raises uncomfortable questions about how much of Elvis's life has been hidden, controlled, or rewritten to protect the empire his name built. The Presley estate faces its greatest challenge yet, not from declining record sales or shifting cultural tastes, but from the undeniable truth written in DNA. In the halls of Graceland, where tourists shuffle through rooms preserved like shrines, Chewy's name is whispered by visitors. They look at Elvis's childhood photos and wonder aloud, do those same eyes look back at us now from Chewy's face? At candlelight vigils held every August 16th, when fans gather to honor the anniversary of Elvis's passing, some now speak of him not just as the king, but as a grandfather whose hidden bloodline has finally come to light. The fan base itself is split, with some embracing Chewy as a rightful heir to the Presley story, while others recoil, fearing his presence tarnishes the myth of their idol. Yet even in the division, one truth emerges. Elvis Presley's legacy is alive, evolving, and more human than ever before. Chewy's words echo louder than any legal battle or headline. He does not seek to dethrone anyone, to lay claim to Graceland, or to sit atop the Presley fortune. His message is simpler and perhaps more powerful. He just wants to belong, to be acknowledged as part of a family he never knew, to find his place in the story of a man the world still calls the king. Whether the Presley family embraces him or not, whether the estate opens its doors or slams them shut, history has already been rewritten. The existence of Chewy Thompson ensures that Elvis's story cannot remain frozen in time. It must now account for a grandson.
Modest now.
Man, I was tame compared to what they do now. Are you kidding? I didn't do anything. We just jiggle, you know.
For decades, fans of Elvis Presley wondered why one of Hollywood's most enchanting actresses, Debra Paget, turned down the king of rock and roll at the height of his fame. Their names once blazed across headlines, their chemistry undeniable, their connection seemingly destined for something more. Yet Elvis, a man who could win the heart of almost any woman in the world, was quietly rejected by Paget. For years, she remained silent, fueling rumors of studio interference, family pressure, and even whispers of hidden scandal. But now, at 92 years old, Debra Paget has spoken. Her words cut through decades of speculation, finally revealing the real reason she walked away from Elvis Presley. It is a story of temptation, survival, and sacrifice. A decision that forever altered the paths of two icons. What she has confessed may change everything fans thought they knew about the king's private life. Long before Elvis Presley ever entered her world, Debra Paget was already being shaped into one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars. Born in Denver, Colorado, in 1933, she grew up in a family that encouraged the performing arts. By her teenage years, her striking beauty and graceful presence made her a natural fit for the silver screen. Hollywood, during the 1940s and 1950s, was a machine that carefully molded its stars into images of perfection, and Paget was no exception. When she signed with 20th Century Fox, the studio executives saw in her not just another actress, but a marketable figure who could embody exotic beauty and old-world elegance for biblical epics and costume dramas. Her breakthrough came with roles in films like Broken Arrow, 1950, where she played opposite James Stewart, and Demetrius and the Gladiators, 1954, which solidified her status as a screen goddess. Paget wasn't just another actress cast in fleeting roles. She was a sensation, gracing the covers of magazines and captivating audiences with a combination of innocence and allure that few could rival. Hollywood insiders often remarked that she seemed destined for greatness, but behind the glamour, her career was tightly controlled. The studio dictated not only the parts she played, but also how she looked, how she spoke, and even who she was seen with publicly. It was a world where every step was calculated, every photograph analyzed for its impact on her marketability. Unlike some of her peers who bent or broke the rules, Debra followed them carefully. knowing her career and her family's livelihood depended on it, and family was always at the center of her life. Unlike many actresses who moved independently through Hollywood, Paget was deeply tied to her mother, who acted as both guardian and guiding force in her decisions. She was raised with a strong sense of faith and morality, something that stood out in an industry where temptation was always just a party away. Those values kept her cautious about the spotlight, careful about the choices she made, and hesitant about falling into relationships that could threaten the delicate balance between her public image and her private beliefs. By the mid-1950s, Debra Paget was everywhere. Audiences marveled at her performance in The Ten Commandments, 1956, where she played Lilia in one of the most celebrated epics of all time. The success of that film placed her among Hollywood's most recognizable faces, but it also placed her under even greater scrutiny. She was not just an actress. She was a commodity, and the studio wanted her to remain untouchable, refined, and free of scandal. It was during this period of immense fame that Elvis Presley exploded onto the national stage. His music, charisma, and raw energy captured the attention of millions, and Hollywood saw in him a new kind of leading man who could bring fresh life to the big screen. The studios were eager to connect Elvis with actresses who carried prestige and beauty, and Debra Paget's name rose to the top of that list. When their worlds collided, the meeting seemed almost inevitable. The king of rock and roll, America's most electrifying new star, drawn to the elegant beauty who represented everything Hollywood adored. Yet while to the outside world this seemed like the perfect match, to Paget it was a complication, one that would force her to balance the demands of fame, her devotion to her family, and the strict control of her studio against the undeniable attraction of Elvis Presley. By 1956, Elvis Presley had become more than just a singer. He was a cultural earthquake shaking the foundations of American music, fashion, and film. His rise from a truck driver in Tupelo, Mississippi, to the biggest star in the world happened almost overnight, and his impact was unlike anything the entertainment industry had ever seen. Teenagers screamed, fainted, and swarmed concert venues, while conservative parents and critics worried about his influence on a generation. With his swiveling hips, smoldering gaze, and raw energy, Elvis became a force Hollywood could not ignore. Studio executives realized that his presence on the silver screen would not only sell tickets, but also redefine what it meant to be a leading man. For his first films, Elvis was carefully paired with actresses who could enhance his appeal and give legitimacy to his acting career. Among them was Debra Paget, who by then had already established herself as one of Hollywood's most captivating performers. When Elvis first encountered her, it wasn't simply admiration, it was infatuation. Those who were close to him at the time recalled how quickly he became enamored with her beauty, her elegance, and her seemingly untouchable aura. Unlike the girls who chased him down after concerts, Paget carried herself with a regal composure that fascinated him. She was everything he wasn't: disciplined, controlled, and steeped in the classical traditions of Hollywood. And that contrast only fueled his determination to win her heart. Elvis pursued her with a sincerity that surprised even his closest friends. He sent flowers, lavished her with attention, and made it clear to those around him that Debra Paget was no passing fancy. At a time when he was linked in the tabloids to a string of young women, insiders whispered that this was different, that Elvis saw in Paget someone he could truly build a life with. Their public appearances together stirred endless speculation. Gossip columns buzzed with rumors of romance, and fans envisioned a glamorous union between the king of rock and roll and one of Hollywood's most admired leading ladies. Yet while Elvis leaned into the possibility of a real relationship, Paget's response was far more complicated. She was polite, warm, and even fond of him, but she never fully embraced his advances. To Elvis, who was used to women falling over themselves for even a moment of his attention, Paget's hesitation was bewildering. Friends recalled how he would speak of her in glowing terms, often wondering aloud why she didn't see what he saw, that they were meant to be. But Paget was not easily swept away. Where others saw the excitement of being pursued by the world's biggest star, she saw danger, pressure, and the possibility of losing control of her carefully built life. For her, Elvis was not simply a man. He was a whirlwind, and stepping into his world could mean surrendering everything she had fought so hard to maintain. It was this tension, the unstoppable force of Elvis Presley, colliding with the immovable caution of Debra Paget, that would define their brief, complicated connection, a connection that even decades later would leave fans asking why she said no. In the golden age of Hollywood, nothing about a star's personal life was truly personal. Studios controlled not only the careers of their actors, but also their reputations, relationships, and in many cases, their private choices. Debra Paget, as one of 20th Century Fox's prized young actresses, lived under that microscope every single day. Every date she went on, every friend she spent time with, and every headline with her name attached was carefully monitored. The studio wasn't just investing in her talent, they were investing in an image, one of purity, refinement, and classical beauty. To executives, she was the perfect embodiment of exotic allure without scandal, a screen siren who drew audiences but still upheld the standards of decency required in the 1950s. Elvis Presley, however, was another story. To Hollywood insiders, Elvis was both a gold mine and a risk. His name brought unparalleled attention, but his rock and roll persona frightened traditionalists. Parents condemned him as dangerous. Preachers accused him of corrupting youth, and even some studio bosses worried about what his presence meant for actresses carefully cultivated as wholesome icons. Pairing Debra Paget with Elvis Presley was a publicity dream. Two of the most beautiful young stars in the world, their chemistry undeniable. But behind closed doors, the studio became increasingly concerned. What if Paget became romantically entangled with Elvis? What if the newspapers began to portray her as another one of his girls? For an actress whose career rested on elegance and refinement, that image could unravel years of careful grooming. Studio bosses made their disapproval known in subtle but powerful ways. Paget was advised to remain polite but distant, to be seen but not too seen, to protect her reputation above all else. The idea of her being swept away by Presley's fame was seen as reckless and potentially damaging. Even more than her own hesitations, this constant oversight created invisible walls between her and Elvis. For every bouquet of flowers Elvis sent, for every word of affection he shared, there were reminders from executives and handlers that she could not risk her future for the king of rock and roll. To make matters more complicated, Debra's own family, particularly her mother, reinforced the same warnings. They knew that aligning too closely with Presley could brand her as reckless, and in an industry where one scandal could end a career, the stakes were too high. So while Elvis pursued her earnestly, Paget found herself trapped between desire and duty, between what she might have wanted and what she was being told was best for her. To the world outside, the tension was invisible. Fans saw two young stars in the same orbit and dreamed of a fairy tale romance. But within the confines of Hollywood's studio system, the reality was suffocating. Debra Paget was not free to follow her heart. She was a product, carefully packaged and sold to the public, and her handlers were determined that nothing, not even Elvis Presley, would be allowed to tarnish that image. To the outside world, Debra Paget lived a dream life. Lavish premieres, starring roles in biblical epics, and her face on magazine covers across America. But beneath the shimmering surface of stardom, she carried burdens invisible to the public eye. She was not only navigating the ruthless studio system, but also the weight of her own upbringing. one defined by faith, morality, and the ever-watchful presence of her family, especially her mother. Unlike many Hollywood starlets who embraced the freewheeling glamour of parties, alcohol, and scandal, Paget was raised in a deeply conservative environment that saw the film industry as both an opportunity and a battlefield for her soul. Every decision she made had to be measured against the values instilled in her since childhood, values that urged modesty, self-control, and spiritual grounding. And yet she lived in a world that celebrated excess. This internal conflict often left her feeling like she was playing two roles, one for the cameras and one in her private heart. Elvis Presley, with his magnetic charm and intoxicating fame, embodied the very contradiction she feared most. On one hand, she admired his talent, his genuine sweetness off stage, and the way he looked at her as though she were the only woman in the room. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the chaos that swirled around him, the screaming fans, the temptations that came with constant touring, the whispers of late-night parties, and endless women vying for his attention. For a woman like Paget, who clung to the idea of marriage as a sacred bond and believed in a life built on stability, the whirlwind of Elvis's existence was not romantic. It was frightening. Friends of Debra would later recall how cautious she was, how she spoke of her fears that marrying a man like Elvis would lead her into a world where she would lose herself completely. It wasn't just about preserving her career, it was about protecting her spirit. She wanted love, yes, but she wanted a love grounded in peace, faith, and security, not in the unpredictable highs and lows of rock and roll fame. Compounding her worries was the immense influence of her mother, Margaret, who was fiercely protective of her daughter's reputation and well-being. Margaret had already seen how Hollywood destroyed young women with promise, and she was determined not to let Debra become another casualty of broken marriages, addictions, or scandals that devoured so many starlets. Her advice was firm. Elvis might be charming, but he was not safe. And Debra, torn between her own conflicted feelings and the counsel of the person she trusted most, chose restraint over surrender. This choice, however, came at a cost. Turning down Elvis was not simply saying no to a man. It was saying no to the possibility of a life lived in the center of the cultural storm, a life that might have brought her even greater fame, but also unimaginable heartache. In rejecting him, she protected herself, but she also carried the quiet sorrow of what might have been. That private battle between longing and fear, between affection and survival, would become one of the most defining struggles of her life, and decades later, she would finally reveal just how much it shaped the path she chose. For Elvis Presley, rejection was a concept he rarely encountered, especially when it came to matters of the heart. By the time he crossed paths with Debra Paget, he was already a national sensation, adored by millions of women who screamed his name, fainted at his concerts, and dreamed of being the one to tame the king of rock and roll. Yet with Debra, it was different. She didn't melt under his gaze, didn't rush to accept his advances, and didn't let his fame sway her into a quick romance. To Elvis, that very hesitation made her all the more captivating. Friends close to him during those early years remembered how serious he was when he spoke of Paget. Unlike the fleeting crushes and playful dalliances he enjoyed with countless admirers, his affection for Debra carried weight. He confided in his inner circle that she was the kind of girl you marry, someone who radiated class and purity, someone who could soften the wild edges of his life. Determined to win her over, Elvis introduced her to his beloved parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley. This was no small gesture. He had brought very few women into that sacred circle. Gladys, in particular, saw in Debra a young woman who carried herself with dignity, and she quietly approved of her son's interest. Elvis, fueled by both youthful passion and a genuine desire for stability, believed that Paget might be the answer to a question he had not yet admitted to the world. How could he be both Elvis Presley, the global superstar, and Elvis Presley, the man searching for love and normalcy. He courted her with persistence, sending flowers, making calls, and finding ways to be near her despite the chaos of his own schedule. He wasn't subtle about his intentions either. Insiders recalled how Elvis would talk about her openly, telling friends that he wanted her by his side, not just as a date for premieres, but as a partner in life. But for all his persistence, Debra remained unmoved. She was gracious and kind toward him, never dismissive or cruel, but she maintained a distance that Elvis could not fully understand. To him, the rejection wasn't about him personally. After all, millions adored him. It was about something deeper he couldn't quite put his finger on, and that mystery gnawed at him. He was used to women being dazzled by his fame, yet here was one who seemed to see past the glitter and the stardom, straight into the man he was struggling to be. That, more than anything, made her refusal sting. The more she resisted, the more determined he became, and yet every attempt to close the gap only reminded him of the wall she had built to protect herself. The king of rock and roll, who had conquered stages, charts, and hearts across the globe, found himself powerless in the face of a single woman's quiet strength. For Elvis, Debra Paget became less of a romantic pursuit and more of an enigma, a reminder that not everything could be won through charm, persistence, or fame. And as the years went by, her refusal would linger in his memory as one of the rare moments when even the king could not get what he wanted. For years, fans speculated about why Debra Paget turned down Elvis Presley. Some blamed the studios, others pointed to her protective mother, while many assumed she simply wasn't interested. But now, at 92, Debra herself has finally broken the silence, and the truth she revealed was far more complex and deeply personal than anyone imagined. In her own words, she admitted that she cared for Elvis, admired him, and even felt drawn to him in ways that surprised her. She described him as tender, sincere, and unlike the wild persona he projected on stage. Yet she knew, even then, that accepting his love would mean stepping into a whirlwind that she could not survive. "I cared for him, but I knew it would destroy me," she confessed, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of decades past. It wasn't disdain that drove her away. It was fear. Fear not of Elvis himself, but of the world that came with him. She had watched other women in Hollywood become entangled in romances that ended in scandal, heartbreak, and ruin. She had seen careers crumble under the weight of bad press and reputations tarnished by the wrong choice of partner. And she had lived long enough in the shadow of the studio system to know that one wrong step could undo everything she had worked for. With Elvis, the risk was even greater. He wasn't just a star, he was a phenomenon, a man who couldn't walk down the street without mobs forming, who couldn't go on stage without chaos erupting. To love him would mean sacrificing privacy, stability, and peace. To marry him would mean living forever under the glare of the public eye, where every smile, every argument, every slip of behavior would be magnified 1,000 times. For a woman raised in faith and discipline, who longed for a quiet family life built on trust and devotion, that was too heavy a price to pay. Debra also admitted that Elvis's own battles frightened her. Even in those early years, she sensed the weight of fame pressing on him, the way he leaned on music to escape pressures he couldn't articulate, and the way temptation followed him at every turn. She worried that his path, as bright as it was, led toward shadows that she had no strength to walk through. Her decision, then, was not a cold rejection, but an act of survival. She chose to protect herself, to preserve the life she wanted, even if it meant turning away from a man who genuinely loved her. And though Elvis may never have fully understood, Debra carried no bitterness. Speaking now, she said she always respected him, always prayed for him, and always remembered him not as the king of rock and roll, but as the young man who looked at her with hope in his eyes. Her revelation strips away the myths and the rumors, leaving behind a portrait of two people caught between love and destiny. Elvis, desperate to claim her heart, and Debra, desperate to save her own. It was a decision that defined the rest of her life, and stands as one of the most striking what-ifs in Hollywood history. After Debra Paget's quiet but firm rejection of Elvis Presley, their lives began to move in separate directions, each path shaped by choices that would ultimately define their legacies. For Elvis, the pain of losing someone he had genuinely admired was buried beneath the noise of fame, but it left an imprint. He would go on to become the most iconic entertainer of the 20th century, a man whose music electrified generations and whose image became larger than life. Yet alongside the glittering career came the turbulence of personal struggles, his volatile relationships, his dependence on prescription drugs, and the suffocating pressures of superstardom. Fans saw the triumphs, the sold-out concerts, the movies, and the adoration. But behind closed doors, Elvis battled demons that Debra Paget had sensed even in the earliest days. Her instincts, which told her that life with him would consume her, were tragically validated as the years unfolded. Meanwhile, Debra's journey took her down a quieter road, one away from the chaos of rock and roll and the flashing cameras of scandal. She continued working in Hollywood for a time, appearing in films that highlighted her unique combination of beauty and grace, but eventually, she made a decision few expected. She stepped away from the industry that had made her famous. Choosing faith, family, and spiritual devotion, she built a life grounded not in fame, but in peace. While Elvis's story became one of tragedy mixed with triumph, Debra's story became one of withdrawal and preservation, a deliberate retreat from a world that demanded more than she was willing to give. Though she never spoke publicly of her decision at the time, those who knew her best understood that rejecting Elvis had been more than just a personal choice. It had been a turning point. Had she said yes, her life would have been consumed by the relentless demands of Presley's orbit. By saying no, she secured for herself a life that, while quieter, gave her the stability she craved. And yet, the question of what if never completely disappeared. Fans speculated for decades about how history might have been rewritten if Debra Paget had become Mrs. Elvis Presley. Would Elvis have found the grounding he so desperately needed? Would her faith and strength have saved him from the self-destructive path that eventually claimed his life? Or would she have been pulled down into the same spiral, another tragic figure lost in the chaos of fame? These unanswered questions kept their story alive long after their romance ended. Debra herself admitted that she sometimes wondered what might have happened, but she remained firm that her decision had been the right one. She lived to see Elvis's rise, his struggles, and ultimately his untimely death at just 42. And with each chapter of his story, she was reminded of why she had walked away. Their paths, so closely intertwined for a brief, shining moment, diverged permanently, leaving behind a lingering sense of destiny interrupted. Elvis Presley became the king, immortalized in music and legend, while Debra Paget chose a different kind of immortality, one of spiritual devotion, private strength, and a legacy not measured by headlines, but by the quiet life she built away from the storm. Looking back now, at 92 years old, Debra Paget's decision to reject Elvis Presley is no longer just a forgotten footnote in Hollywood gossip columns. It is a defining chapter in the lives of two icons whose paths briefly crossed, but ultimately diverged forever. For Elvis, the rejection of the woman he openly admired served as a rare reminder that his fame and charm did not guarantee him everything he desired. He would go on to marry Priscilla Beaulieu, father a daughter, and continue building the towering legacy that made him a cultural giant. But those who knew him best understood that Elvis long carried the memory of Debra as the one who said no when nearly everyone else said yes. And for Debra, the choice became a cornerstone of her own life. By stepping away from Elvis, She preserved the stability she valued most, the grounding that came not from fame or power, but from faith and personal conviction. She would later withdraw almost completely from Hollywood, marrying, raising a family, and devoting herself to her spiritual life. While Elvis was consumed by the blinding spotlight of superstardom, Paget found her peace in a life of relative obscurity, living by the values instilled in her since childhood. And in doing so, she survived an industry that left many of her peers broken and lost. The legacy of her choice echoes loudly in the way fans continue to wonder what might have been. What if she had said yes? Could her unwavering faith and steady presence have been the anchor Elvis so desperately needed? Could she have saved him from the destructive patterns that plagued his personal life? Or would she have been another casualty of the king's unstoppable momentum? These questions can never be answered, yet they remain an essential part of the myth surrounding both their lives. What we do know is that Debra's decision was not made out of cruelty, arrogance, or indifference. It was a conscious act of survival, a recognition that love, no matter how alluring, can sometimes come at too high a cost. At 92, when asked to reflect, she spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. She remembered Elvis not as the untouchable king of rock and roll, but as a young man, charming, vulnerable, and deeply sincere. She respected him, prayed for him, and carried his memory with quiet grace, even as she chose a life that kept her far from the turmoil of his world. And in that truth lies the power of her revelation. It humanizes Elvis, reminding us that beneath the legend was a man who longed for love and stability. And it illuminates Debra's quiet strength, the strength to say no in an era when saying no to someone like Elvis Presley seemed impossible. Their story is not one of scandal, but of crossroads, of a woman who valued peace over chaos.
They asked me to do it, and I was anxious to do some live appearances. You know, it'd been a long time since I've been on stage in front of anybody live. And I was anxious.
For nearly half a century, she kept her silent. Elvis Presley's maid lived inside Graceland longer than most, seeing the king of rock and roll in his most private, unguarded moment. She dusted the rooms where he prayed, folded the clothes he wore, and listened as his voice carried through the halls when no one else was there. To the world, Elvis was untouchable, an icon of music, wealth, and fame. But behind the locked gates, he was something else entirely. Restless, troubled, kind, lonely, and haunted by pressures no stage could reveal. For years, she said nothing, out of respect, out of fear, out of grief. But now, 45 years after Elvis's death, she is opening up for the first time. She describes the life behind Graceland's closed doors, the laughter, the sadness, the late-night whispers, and the tragic decline of a man the world thought it knew. What she reveals changes everything. When she first arrived at Graceland, she expected a mansion full of glitter and glamour. What she found instead was a house that felt more like a fortress, grand on the outside, but strangely heavy inside. Elvis had bought Graceland in 1957, at the height of his fame, and by the time she came to work there, the estate had grown into a living museum of his life. The long hallways stretched with velvet drapes and ornate furniture, every corner carrying the scent of cologne, leather, and cigarette smoke. Yet beneath the luxury, there was a sense of tension, as though the walls themselves carried secrets. Her duties were endless: dusting antique, cleaning up after late-night gatherings, keeping Elvis's personal spaces spotless. But nothing about Graceland was ordinary. At times, it was filled with the noise of friends, cousins, and bodyguards, the so-called Memphis Mafia, laughing, talking, and moving through the rooms at all hours of the night. Other times, it felt like a tomb, silent and eerie, with only the sound of Elvis pacing the floor upstairs. She recalled how Elvis would often wander from room to room in the middle of the night, restless, as though searching for something he couldn't quite find. The rules inside the mansion were clear. Privacy was sacred. Certain rooms, especially Elvis's upstairs suite, were off limits. No one entered unless summoned, and even then, You stepped cautiously. Still, she would sometimes glimpse his shadow moving behind a door, or hear his voice faintly singing to himself. Those were the moments she realized Elvis wasn't just the king adored by millions. He was a man battling the stillness of his own home. And yet, Graceland wasn't without joy. She remembered evenings when Elvis would sit at the piano, calling everyone into the music room to sing gospel hymns until dawn. His voice, unfiltered and raw, would echo through the house like a prayer, and even the staff felt the power of those moments. For her, those nights were reminders that Elvis's true home was not on stage, but in music, surrounded by people he trusted. Still, there was always a sense of isolation. Despite the open doors, the bustling entourage, and the steady stream of visitors, Graceland could feel like a cave. Elvis lived behind gates to escape the screaming fans outside, but within those gates he built walls of his own. For the maid who walked those halls daily, it was clear that Graceland was both a sanctuary and a prison. She witnessed the contrast in ways no one else could. The laughter downstairs, the silence upstairs, and the heavy burden carried by the man who owned it all. Elvis Presley was known to the world as a superstar, but to those who worked close to him, he was something far more complicated, a man whose generosity seemed to know no limits. The maid recalls countless times when Elvis would hand over the keys to a brand new Cadillac, or slip cash into the hands of someone who looked like they needed help. To him, giving was second nature. He bought cars for employees, jewelry for friends, and even paid hospital bills for strangers he had never met. She remembered one evening when Elvis gathered the entire staff together and, without warning, presented them each with a gift, from fur coats to watches, insisting they take it as a token of his appreciation. He never seemed happier than when he was giving something away. But there was another side to this generosity. She saw how people began to expect it, how they hovered around him, not just for his company, but for what he could provide. Elvis's kindness was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He was surrounded by people who often saw him as a never-ending fountain of wealth, and though he must have known it, he couldn't stop himself from giving. The maid described times when Elvis would hand out stacks of $100 bills, laughing as he did it, but later retreat to his room, shoulders heavy, as though he realized his generosity could never fill the emptiness inside. To the outside world, Elvis looked like a man who had everything. Inside Graceland, she saw the truth. He was a man who gave everything he could, sometimes at the expense of his own peace. She remembered how he would light up when he surprised someone, how his eyes would sparkle when he saw joy on another person's face. But she also remembered how quickly that light would fade when the crowd was gone and he was left in silence. Elvis's generosity was a reflection of his heart, a heart too big for one man to carry alone. The maid, who had accepted gifts from him herself, understood that these gestures were not just about money or material things. They were Elvis's way of connecting, of showing love, of fighting back against the loneliness that clung to him even when he was surrounded by people. 45 years later, she still remembers the warmth of those moments, but also the sadness hidden behind them. Elvis Presley's love life was the stuff of legend, whispered about in tabloids and speculated on by fans, but for the maid inside Graceland, it was not rumor, it was reality. She saw the late-night visits, the secretive calls, the hurried footsteps of women leaving in the early hours of the morning. Elvis was magnetic, and women seemed to orbit around him as though they had no choice. Some were actresses, some were singers, and others were simply admirers who caught his attention for a moment in time. The maid recalled how Elvis never liked to be alone at night. He filled the empty hours with parties, music, and companionship, sometimes inviting entire groups of people back to Graceland after a show. The house would swell with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the sounds of Elvis holding court, telling stories, singing, and basking in the glow of company. But she also noticed the pattern. Behind the excitement was a man who feared silence, a man who dreaded the stillness of an empty room. She remembered cleaning up after those nights, lipstick-stained glasses, ashtrays overflowing, and the faint trace of perfume lingering in the air long after everyone had gone. To outsiders, it may have looked like decadent, but she saw something else. A man desperately trying to outrun his loneliness. Elvis's relationships were passionate, intense, and often short-lived. He craved connection, but struggled to maintain it. The maid recalled how he could be tender one moment, writing note and giving gifts, then distant the next, retreating into himself. Women adored him, but she believed few truly understood him. She saw the heartbreak on both sides, his and theirs, as romances sparked brightly and then faded into the shadows of Graceland. The parties themselves often blurred into a routine. Sometimes they were joyful gatherings with music so powerful it shook the wall. Other times, they felt forced, as though Elvis was putting on another performance. Even in his own home, the maid would watch him laugh, dance, and sing, but she knew it wasn't always genuine. When the lights dimmed and the guests left, his eyes often told a different story. The women, the party, the noise. All of it was an attempt to fill a void that nothing ever truly satisfied. For the maid, those nights were proof of the contradiction that defined Elvis Presley, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. Behind the glimmer of sequined jumpsuits and the roar of packed arenas was a man fighting battles few ever saw. The maid recalls how Elvis's struggle with his health became more visible with each passing year, though most of the world was shielded from the worst of it. She cleaned the pill bottles scattered across nightstands, the prescription slips tucked into drawers, and the half-finished drink meant to ease pain that never seemed to go away. Elvis's body, worn down by years of grueling tours, late night, and an unhealthy lifestyle, was betraying him. Yet he kept pushing himself to perform, to give the audience the king they expected. She remembered nights when Elvis came home drenched in sweat, his face pale, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step took effort. Sometimes he would collapse into a chair, silent, exhausted, and she would catch glimpses of a man carrying more than his body could handle. Other times, he would retreat upstairs, closing himself off for hours, and the staff knew better than to disturb him. The mood in Graceland shifted constantly. Moments of joy and music often gave way to stretches of darkness where Elvis seemed unreachable. The maid described how he would swing between bursts of energy, laughing with his entourage or showering gifts on those around him, and sudden crushing silences where his eyes looked hollow. The pills were always there, small bottles hidden in plain sight, an attempt to manage pain, anxiety, and insomnia, but she could see how they took their toll. His moods grew unpredictable. His once sharp wit dulled at times, and his body, once strong and athletic, began to carry the weight of years of abuse. She remembered hearing him at night, pacing upstairs, sometimes singing softly to himself, sometimes muttering prayers, fragments of conversations no one else could hear. These were the moments when she realized Elvis was not just the king of rock and roll. He was a man locked in a battle he was slowly losing. The world saw a legend, but inside Graceland, the maid saw a man unraveling under the pressure of being Elvis Presley. She could not intervene, could not change the path he was on, but she carried the memory of those dark struggles with her, long after the lights of Graceland dimmed. If the world believed Graceland was a fairy tale palace, the maid knew it was often the setting for family drama that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. Elvis's life was filled with people who loved him, but also people who depended on him, emotionally, financially, and professionally. That dependence created tension, and she saw it play out behind closed doors in ways the public never knew. Arguments between Elvis and Priscilla echoed through the mansion even after their divorce, sometimes soft, private, other times heated and impossible to ignore. They loved one another, she believed, but theirs was a love strained by distance, fame, and expectations no marriage could survive. Then, there was Lisa Marie, their daughter, the one person who seemed able to melt Elvis's heart, no matter his mood. The maid recalled tender moments where Elvis would sit on the floor, letting Lisa climb on his back, laughing like he wasn't the king of rock and roll, but just a proud father. Yet even those moments carried shadow. Elvis worried about the example he set, and sometimes his darker moods left him withdrawn, unable to give Lisa the steady father figure he wished to be. Beyond his immediate family, there were the Memphis Mafia, friends who had become fixtures in his life, but who often blurred the line between loyalty and self-interest. The maid heard their whispers, saw their rivalry, and noticed how their influence sometimes fueled Elvis's worst impulse. They protected him, yes, but they also enabled him, and she believed Elvis knew it deep down. His extended family added another layer of complexity. Graceland was never empty, filled with relatives, cousins, and hangers-on who treated the mansion like their own. To them, Elvis was both a loved one and a lifeline, and that pressure weighed on him constantly. The maid remembered nights when Elvis would retreat to his room after arguments, slamming the door, pacing, and muttering about how everyone wanted something from him. At times, he seemed surrounded but utterly alone. These tensions took a toll not only on Elvis but on the atmosphere of Graceland itself. The house could feel joyful and alive one day, filled with laughter, and heavy and suffocating the next, filled with silence after a fight. For the maid, it was clear that Elvis's greatest battles weren't just against fame or his own health. They were against the strain of family and loyalty, love and disappointment, trust and betrayal. It was within these walls that she saw Elvis not as a legend, but as a man caught between being everything to everyone and struggling to hold himself together. As the summer of 1977 approached, the maid noticed changes in Elvis that chilled her to the core. The man who once commanded stages with boundless energy was now moving slower. His body weighed down not just by age, but by years of exhaustion, health problems, and prescription drugs. She remembered how the house seemed quieter than usual, as though everyone inside sensed something was coming. Elvis still laughed, still sang, still gave glimpses of the vibrant man he had been, but the light in his eyes flickered more often than it shone. He spent long hours upstairs in his private suite, sometimes emerging late at night to wander the halls or play gospel music on the piano, his voice soft and haunting. The staff tiptoed around him, unsure whether they would encounter him in a good mood or lost in silence. His health grew more fragile by the day, his face puffier, his movements stiffer, his speech occasionally slurred. The maid noticed how much he leaned on others to complete even simple tasks, and how often he would retreat to rest between activities that once gave him joy. Still, he pushed himself to keep up the image of the king, rehearsing for performances, making plans, insisting he would soon be stronger. She described how his eating habits worsened, his dependence on medication deepened, and the tension inside Graceland grew thicker with every passing day. Conversations among the staff were hushed, concerned whispers about whether Elvis could endure much longer. His loved ones tried to reach him, tried to pull him away from the spiral, but he resisted, determined to remain in control of his own life. The maid remembered vividly how even in his most fragile moments, Elvis would flash a smile or crack a joke to ease the worries of those around him, as though he could sense their fear. But she also remembered the emptiness that followed, the weight of silence that seemed to hang over the mansion. For her, those final days were not just about witnessing the decline of a legend. They were about watching a man fight a losing battle against time, against his own body, and against the walls that fame had built around him. The morning of August 16, 1977, is etched into the maid's memory as vividly as though it happened yesterday. She remembered how the air inside Graceland felt unusually heavy that day, as if the house itself knew something was about to change forever. Elvis had stayed up late the night before, restless as usual, moving between his bedroom and the bathroom, flipping through books, and speaking in a low voice that drifted through the upstairs hall. The maid had grown accustomed to his unpredictable hours, but that morning she recalled a silence that felt different, unsettling. Around mid-morning, whispers began spreading through the mansion. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. She remembered hearing hurried footsteps, voices rising in panic, the sound of a phone being dialed frantically. Then the words came, words that froze her where she stood. Elvis had been found, collapsed on the bathroom floor. She could still picture the chaos that followed, the Memphis Mafia rushing upstairs, the frantic cries for help, and the devastating realization that the king of rock and roll was not breathing. She did not see him immediately, but she saw the faces of those who did, pale, shaken, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The maid described how the atmosphere inside Graceland turned surreal, like the entire house had been plunged into a nightmare. She remembered clutching a rag in her hand, unable to move, tears blurring her vision as the sound of sirens grew louder outside. Paramedics rushed in, pushing past staff and family, their voices urgent, their footsteps pounding against the floors she had polished so many times. Elvis was carried out on a stretcher, and in that moment, the maid felt the world shift. The man she had served, the man she had seen laugh, cry, sing, and struggle was gone. The noise outside the gates grew quickly, crowds of fans gathering as news spread like wildfire. But inside, there was only shock, disbelief, and grief so thick it suffocated everyone in the house. The maid remembered the smell of coffee growing cold in the kitchen, the half-finished breakfast that no one touched, the phones ringing endlessly as the outside world demanded answers. She stood in the shadow, watching as those closest to Elvis tried to hold themselves together, their faces streaked with tears. For her, it was not just the death of a legend. It was the loss of a man she had cared for, a man whose humanity she had witnessed when no one else was looking. That morning, August 16, 1977, became the dividing line between before and after, a moment when the music stopped, the laughter faded, and the king of rock and roll became a memory. Even decades later, she could still hear the sound of those sirens, still feel the weight of that silence, still remember the shattering realization that Elvis Presley, larger than life, was gone forever. For decades after that morning in August 1977, the maid carried her memories like a locked chest she could not open. She went about her life quietly, never granting interview, never writing tell-all book, never seeking fame or fortune from the story she alone could tell. Her loyalty to Elvis was unshakable, and for 45 years she lived with the weight of secrets that the world desperately wanted to know. But time has a way of changing things. As the years passed, as those who once crowded Graceland began to fade away, and as the myth of Elvis grew larger than the man himself, she began to feel a responsibility, not to scandalize, not to exploit, but to finally give her testimony, to show the world the truth about who Elvis Presley really was. She explained that the reason she stayed silent was because Elvis trusted her, because he welcomed her into his home and allowed her to see him as no fan ever could. But with so many rumors, so many distortions of his legacy, she decided that the silence had to end. When she finally opened up, what she revealed was not the sordid gossip the tabloids love, but the humanity behind the legend. She spoke of his laugh, the way it could fill a room and disarm even the most tense atmosphere. She spoke of his tenderness, the way he would crouch down to tie his daughter Lisa Marie's shoes or sit with her for hours, reading stories like any ordinary father. She spoke of his generosity, the quiet acts of kindness he performed without cameras or headlines, the countless lives he touched not through music but through compassion. But she also spoke of his struggles, his dependence on pills, his bouts of loneliness that no amount of fame could cure, the way he sometimes looked into the distance as though he wished he could trade places with an ordinary man just for a day. She described the weight he carried, the burden of being Elvis Presley, and how it was a role that demanded more than any human could give. For her, Elvis was not just a star. He was a man of contradiction, capable of immense joy and crushing sadness, a man who belonged to the world but never truly belonged to himself. Breaking her silence after 45 years was not easy. She knew it would stir emotions, reopen old wounds, and invite questions she had long avoided. But she also knew that her story was necessary. She wanted people to understand that Elvis was more than the stage, more than the record, more than the myth that had grown in the years since his passing. He was flesh and blood, fragile and flawed, but filled with a heart so big it often broke under its own weight. In her words, Elvis was not just the king of rock and roll. He was a man who gave everything he had to the world, and in return, the world never let him rest. 45 years later, as she finally speaks, her testimony is not one of scandal, but of truth. The truth that behind the glitter, behind the fame, behind the locked gates of Graceland, there was a man searching for peace, a man who longed to be understood, a man whose music came from both his joy and his pain. And as she reflects on the years she spent in his service, her voice carries both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the life cut short. Gratitude for having known the real Elvis Presley. For her, telling this story is not just about remembering the past. It is about ensuring that the world never forgets the man behind the legend.